everybody. This is so great. So many familiar faces. It's wonderful. I don't think it's a testament to turnover, but it's really nice. We just had a board chair breakfast, and I have to say, given the fact that my tenure and that of some of my colleagues at Playwrights Horizon defies all issues of good governance. It was really lovely to see familiar faces who can talk about old and new issues, and Lord knows we all have them. So, my few remarks have to do with the National Council for the American Theater, and as we all know, TCG theaters are not mom-and-pop groceries anymore, and we have 60 dedicated trustees at this conference, and it's probably the largest number of trustees ever to attend this fall forum, and it's a joint testament to the growing importance of the role of boards in our theaters and to the topic at hand, the essential partnership between the art we produce and the armature of governance and fiscal soundness that supports it. And building that partnership is in itself something of an art, and it can be pleasurable and rewarding. And I have to add that this was not always the case. And my dear friend Jan Whitehead, who I know is here, Jan, where are you? There she is. Hi. Is the person who writes and wrote most eloquently about sometimes the disconnect between money/governance, concerns about art, concerns about other things, and how we always have to keep our eye on the ball. And I think that's true, but I certainly think that's true. But there's a need to meld the two today in ways that we never had to before. So back to the trustees. 20 of the 60 trustees here are members of the National Council for the American Theater. And we are a group of 41 from member theaters across the country who serve as guides and advisors to TCG on matters of program on governance and board development. We meet 2 or 3 times a year, and we interact with the board, and we interact with members of the national and international theater community. It's an extremely rewarding experience. This engagement is real, it's stimulating, and it serves to reinforce the fact that trustees are an ever more important part of the theater ecosystem. So I would like the members of the National Council who are here to stand, and let's give them a round of applause. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about joining the National Council, please be sure to talk to Kevin Moore. Where's Kevin?
Back here.
Here he is. Okay. You'll get lots of good information, so please don't hesitate. Make a note and do it before the end of this forum. And we are delighted to be hosts this year for this forum. This is biased. I think it's the best meeting we have of all the year. And it's extremely useful. And remember last year we talked about capitalization, and it was something that all of us took home, and it's extremely useful, and I think that this year's session is going to be just as useful, and we'll build on that. So I thank you very much for coming, and have a great weekend. Bye.
Good morning. I'm here to speak a little bit about a new TCG initiative directed towards trustees. Many of you are familiar with the book, The Art of Governance, which is a terrific compilation of essays and resources and tools that was curated and compiled by Jan Whitehead and Nancy Roach. TCG has convened a task force of trustees to look at that collection of materials. It's 10 years later now. How do we go about updating it? And we're talking about interesting things, not just about how we update the content, but how we use that content. And now that we're living in the digital age, do we want to use that content in different ways? So I think it's going to be an exciting project. It'll happen over the next couple of years. We're looking to get input from as many trustees as we can. So we will have formal ways of getting input from the National Council and also the trustee network. So if you're not one of those two bodies, the first thing I'm going to say is, why don't you join one? And then you'll be part of the update process. But if that is not happening in your future in the next year or so, feel free to contact me, other people you'll learn about that are on the task force. I'm one of the co-chairs along with Ralph Bryan from the Hoya Playhouse. So we're looking forward to the project. Alyssa Moore and Lori Baskin from TCG are working with us on it. And we're excited about getting your input, making it very relevant for what you face today, the issues and also the way you work and you learn. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gail and Judy. That's a perfect segue for our first speaker, who has written and presented extensively on the subject of board governance and organizational culture. Dr. Cathy A. Trower is president of Trower & Trower, Inc., and the author of many board-related publications, including The Practitioner's Guide to Governance as Leadership, Building High-Performing Nonprofit Boards. And by the way, we have that book available for purchase at the TCG bookstore here today. Formerly research director at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Cathy has served as a consultant and coach to boards and executives of over 100 nonprofit organizations. Please join me in welcoming Cathy Trower to the stage.
Good morning. Good morning. Delighted to be here with you this morning, and thank you for that nice, short introduction. I was reminded not too long ago of introduction from a gentleman from Maine. I was speaking at a workshop, and he said this. He said, "This is Cathy. She's our speaker. Her job is to talk, ours is to listen. Let's hope she's done before we are." I'll never forget it. This is going in the next book that's going to be, you can't make this stuff up. Lots of wonderful stories about governance as well. So I want to start this morning, and I just, first of all, by saying thank you for being here. I love the energy in the room. I kind of sat up here in front and was watching people come in and the interaction. It's really, really gratifying. It's so exciting to see that you're all excited to talk about governance on a Saturday morning. So I'm kind of wondering, did you really party much last night? Okay. Where I'd like to start is with this. I want to pose a question to the audience, and it's this. Why do some nonprofit boards underperform? Not maybe your board, but some other boards maybe on which you sit or that you've heard of. What are some reasons for underperformance? Yes?
It's somebody else's job.
Ah, whose is it? It's somebody else's job.
The development director.
It's the development directors. Right? She's not here, is that what you said? Certainly we think about, fundraising is that person's job, although boards are instrumental in that, and we're talking about capitalization throughout the day. It's interesting. Governance, really, is that somebody else's job? Sorry, it's the board's job. But it's one of the reasons for underperformance. What else? Anyone? Yes?
Unclear expectations.
Unclear expectations. What are we supposed to be doing anyway, right? And there's a gentleman right behind you was that yours?
That was going to say that.
Oh my gosh, okay. What are the chances? What else?
Nobody's talking about it.
Nobody's talking about it. About what great governance is or how to do it?
The issues.
Okay. No one's talking about it. What are you talking about at board meetings? What else?
Too busy.
Too busy. Right. We are, after all, volunteers. We volunteer to sit on boards, nonprofits, and by the way, we pay for the privilege of sitting on nonprofit boards, right? Because they want our money. What else?
They don't understand their role.
Okay. Unclear expectations and not understanding their role. Sir or ma'am? Sorry.
Lack of education of what it is
Oh, lack of education about what we're supposed to do as boards, right? We lack education. What are we supposed to be doing? Who's helping us? What else?
Taking the safe way out.
Safe way out. What does that mean?
Unwillingness to take risks.
Unwillingness to take risks. Lots of times I watch boards and it really just feels like a congeniality contest. You know, we nod, we're polite, we want to go along and get along, we're a little bit worried about taking risks because of what might happen. And yet, dealing with the arts, if we can't take risks, what have we got, right? What else?
It's like lack of engagement, like I'm just gonna come to the meeting and then.
Yeah, lack of engagement. Right? I'm just going to come to the meeting and then I'm going to go home. So I'm doing my duty as a board and then I'm going to go home. I'll come up here in front and first back here.
I think a lot of it is lack of diversity on the board as far as not just racial or composition, but in ways of thinking.
Yes. It is so essential. So maybe not always race, gender, and ethnicity, those kinds of things, but different ways of thinking. Absolutely essential. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later this morning, and I have an entire chapter in the book devoted to critical thinking and the importance of divergent thinking on board members. It's one of the reasons you want a diverse group of people, because you want the different ways of thinking. What else, Joan? See, I can see your name. This is what happens when you sit in the front.
Resistance to change.
Resistance to change. Okay. Really? Right. And this gets a little bit not wanting to take risks or get outside there, but resistance to change and trying something new. What else?
I'm on the board for the wrong reasons. Not, I don't care about the mission.
Oh, yeah. On the board for the wrong reasons, right? The wrong reasons, right? I'm on it for social reasons, what if it looks good for me, you know, my name and all of that. Way in the back, yes ma'am.
Yeah, lack of significant investment in or energy around the art itself.
Okay, lack of investment in the art itself or interest in. Now, why would you be on the board of a theater, you know? And there was somebody else went, yes, sir?
Lack of good board leadership.
Okay, lack of leadership. Of board leadership. Not any of the board chairs in this room, he's not referring to you. Yes, over here.
We're just kind of giggling. No.
Tell us.
No, said someday she'll look over here. That's
Oh, okay, sorry. I do make my way, really.
I would say not the right mix and skill set.
Okay, wrong mix and skill set. Let's face it, we're all just people, and we don't always play nicely in the sandbox together. Sometimes you don't have the skill set that you need. What else?
Trust or a safe space to speak your mind.
Lack of trust, safe space to speak your mind. If you can't speak your mind in the boardroom, you've got big problems, but it happens all the time. It doesn't feel safe. We're afraid to say what we really think. Yes?
Either out of date or lack of strategic plan.
Okay. Out of date or lack of a strategic plan. Yes?
I'm only 1 out of 50.
I'm only 1 out of 50.
Or 70.
Or 70. You have great big boards, most of you. Pretty big. Some of you have smaller boards. Right, so, but I'm only 1 out of 50. Where is the individual accountability in that? Boards lack accountability. This is a huge issue. Who's responsible? So there's an old joke that if management screws up, fire management. Board screws up, fire management. Who are the executive directors out there? You know what I'm saying, right? We have another one.
Lack of financial resources to provide the education.
Okay, we lack the resources to provide that education that is so needed. A few more, one more.
Lack of understanding of the business model.
Okay, business model?
It was one of those evenings.
The business model. I'm actually, my industry for many years was higher education. And we got, the entire sector got downgraded by Moody's. last year. The entire sector of higher education, boom, downgraded because of this issue of the business model. Continuing to increase tuition, right, without being able to support it, and basically not doing enough with online, things like tenure and that kind of thing, not understanding the business model. You can't just keep raising tuitions and then offering a higher and higher discount rate to get all the students that you want and expect to stay in business. Really? And all these smart people serve on these boards. It's not as if you have a collection of idiots around the table. Like, what is with that? All right. We have a lot of reasons, and I'm sure everybody around in this room has other reasons why nonprofit boards underperform. And this actually applies in often cases to corporate boards as well, but our focus is on nonprofit boards, which I think are infinitely more challenging than corporate boards. And the reason they are, one of the reasons they are, is because you're just not there to maximize shareholder wealth. You know, that's not what does that even mean? You have a lot of different stakeholders in what you do. And it's very, very complicated. It's very, very messy, which makes it, I think, infinitely interesting. So, one of my reasons, my favorite reason why they underperform is because they can't. And it gets a little bit to the point that was made about who's accountable. I'm one of 50, you know, but it does get to a lot of these other reasons as well. One CEO of a nonprofit put it this way: my board is a bit like potted plants. They're decorative, but they don't really do much. And she was saying, you know, we feed and water them, but they don't do a lot. They're disengaged. That was one of the things that we had up here, a lack of engagement. And another one, I don't have this particular slide today, but it says this: what do you think is the #1 CEO complaint about their board? It's disengagement. But tied with that #1 CEO complaint about their board, my board is engaged. Think about that, right? So be careful what you ask for. Oh my gosh, what have we done? So my good friend Dutch Leonard at the Harvard Business School put it this way: the central challenge of leadership in nonprofits is that mediocrity is survivable. Isn't that sad? But it's true. And all of a sudden the air just went out of the room. Because none of you in this room are mediocre people. You didn't I don't think you got up this morning and said, I can't wait to go to the TCG conference and talk about governance and be mediocre. Woo! I'm excited about that, can't wait. No, we're not mediocre. It's not even in our DNA for us, most of us, I don't think, as individuals. And yet, mediocrity across the sector is survivable in a different way. Obviously not so in the private sector. So it's not as if, you know, a church is going to go away because it's poorly governed. Lots of liberal arts colleges out there, very small, very fragile, but they're not going away. They have these lifelong kind of endowments and things that keep them going, even though basically there's a lot of mediocrity. So sad but true. Okay, this is kind of a long list of what things about the best boards, and I want to just draw your attention to a couple things on this list. First of all, the best boards demonstrate allegiance to the mission. So we talked a little bit about not understanding the organization, what that mission is, what our role is with respect to that mission. And it is absolutely essential. That's the #1 ingredient for the best boards, is that they keep the mission ever present at their meetings. How many of your boards have a mission moment at board meetings? Very few. So what do you do? What do you do with your mission moment?
We start each board meeting with a reading of the scene of the upcoming play.
Awesome.
So give people a sneak peek, and get them excited and give them the information about the play.
Okay, so they start each board meeting with opening scene from the upcoming play. And just to get people excited and know what's coming. I love that. What do you do?
The actors that are in productions, designers, costumers, show things.
Actors, customers, production folks come and make a little presentation. What do you do?
We also do that. We also have a moment in each board meeting where it's called Behind the Curtain. This last one we showed how we curate the season. What goes into putting the season together.
How we curate the season.
With costs associated with that.
Fabulous. There are a lot of things, so I hope you can take away some ideas from your colleagues there. Opening board meetings with a mission moment is so critical. A scene, an actor, curators, whatever the case may be. You could invite a member from the audience from a recent production to come see what the experience was like. Whatever you do. I liked one of the things that came out, it's in your packets, but talking about honest group conversations about the challenges, and this person wrote in that I think our ability to connect so intimately with the board has a great deal to do with the company we have committed to. They feel responsibility to not only the success of the theater, but to the artists themselves. I think that the value of a company of actors is underestimated when it comes to long-term health of an organization. So I don't know which one of you wrote that, but I really love that idea. And thinking in your mission moment about the community that you're creating, it's really essential. It's one way to really engage your board members. So the board should actually epitomize the organization's values. The board should be an example of what you value in their diversity, in the way they convene, in the way they talk to each other, their respect and trust and openness. This is all really critical because, let's face it, the boards sit at the top of our organizations and they have a lot of influence. They should understand your culture and its importance. And they can't understand your culture if they don't experience it, if you don't give them opportunities to interact. So really essential. I think the best boards are also a strategic asset to the organization. So I think about boards like I think about any other strategic asset that an organization can possibly have, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit. And if you start to think about, is my board a strategic asset? If not, and this gets to do we have the right people on there? Do we have the skill set that we need? And start thinking about board composition in terms of diversity of thought. Skill set, what they're bringing to the table, not just financially, but intellectual capital, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, that's absolutely essential. Not just financial capital, but intellectual capital, political capital, who they can make connections to, and having them thinking about what they can bring to the organization, not just what the organization can do for them. Very important. Best boards are thought partners in leadership with the team, the staff. And this one, what I mean is when a board meets, the best boards are actually a think tank. Your executive director and the senior staff, whoever those people are, you're nodding, right? You've got a pro bono think tank sitting around the table with you talking about critical issues, not listening to reports. Listening to reports is deadly. I'll get into that in just a second. So we want to make sure that they're thinking independently, but they're governing collectively. So we need to have steps that help us understand what the collective thinks, and we're going to walk through some of that this morning. They elevate the interests of the organization over their self-interest. It isn't just about a certain personal agenda, although I know that sometimes trustees are guilty of having personal agendas. They demand discourse and debate in the boardroom. We'll talk about that. And they're committed to continuous improvement. They're actually self-aware of their performance. And so this helps us get around all of these reasons why nonprofit boards can underperform. So I have a number of I have a number of observations about boards. So we can say all these things. It's not always their fault that they're unengaged, right? So some of the impediments to great governance. This is one of the biggest ones. They're bored. I've been to so many board meetings where I've observed, or board meetings on which I've sat, and it's a series of reports. And you know what? They actually sent the reports in advance, so I've already read them. I don't need to sit there and listen to you, go through your 25-page PowerPoint with sub-bullets, etc., and read it to me. Committee report, executive director's report, finance person's report. Don't put smart people in the room and then read to them. Okay, it's deadly. So that's impediment number one to great governance. Number two, our brains are on overload. That says, Mr. Osborne, may I be excused, my brain is full. So, this is funny thing about being bored, but our brains are also overloaded. And we need to think about the information that we provide to our boards, because this is what some of us feel like on any given day. A study out of the University of California, San Diego showed that the average American has, at any given day, 34 gigabytes of information coming at them in all the forms that it comes at you. Of course, in New York, you get on an elevator, something's talking to you, get in a taxi, something's talking to you, you're interacting with a couple of devices, plus you have a headset on, and you're reading. I don't know how people do it. The study shows that it's actually 100,000 words are part of the 34 gigabytes that come at you at any given day. And our brains can't possibly parse 100,000 words. Now, my husband says, Cathy, you speak 100,000 words at dinner. I get paid to talk. What can I say? It's pretty cool. Since my nickname as a child was Chatty Cathy. Do you remember that doll? Some of you might remember at a certain age. Younger people look at the light. So there's a Chatty Cathy doll, and you actually could pull a cord on her back, and she would say different things. Anyway, I don't know what that's got to do with this, except for my husband said, like, are you going to talk about me again? Like, no, really, I promise not to. But 100,000 words is a lot. We can't parse it. Our brains go on overload. They shut down. What we tend to do, though, because our brains are on overload, is we actually multitask. How many of you guys multitask? You know my definition of multitasking. Screwing up several things at once. So, studies have also shown that less than 0.5% of the world's population can do two things at once. Multitask. Less than 1% of the world's population can actually multitask. And they only mean doing two things at once, okay? We don't. The thing is, most of us think we can. Most of us think we actually, I'm good at that, I'm great at that. I have no problem with that. Well, really? This is why you don't want people texting and driving, even necessarily talking on a cell phone and driving. There's an old joke about you can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, I'm sorry, but this is true. So that's the second reason, really, why governance is a challenge. Another challenge to great governance is that data and distraction are making us stupid. And I don't mean I'm saying you're stupid, but great article came out. You can Google it. It's called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And it was in the Atlantic in 2005 by Jerome Carr. Maybe you saw it. What happens when you go to, say you're reading a New York Times article, you go online, and what happens as you're reading in the very first paragraph? What do you see? An ad. So there's ads, maybe they're even moving on your screen. That just totally, it's like, really? Let's make them stop, right? What else? There's a link, right? Hyperlink. So in most articles, there's a link. Who can resist the link? Can you resist it? You can resist the link? No problem. Good for you. A lot of us can't resist the links. More data. Something else to read. Okay, so then you follow the link. Guess what? More links, right? So you start reading that. What this piece shows is that very few people, there are exceptions, can resist the links and actually, if they do, actually read all the way to the end of the article. So first, that's one thing. If you go and follow the link, what they've also shown is very few people go back to the original piece. And they end up maybe at 3 or 4 different places, and pretty soon, who knows how much time has gone by. And what they've shown is people then don't make the connection. So if you did go to all those other cool things to learn, presumably to learn something else, you don't go back and in your mind put it all together. Okay, so what did that mean that I visited 5 sites in 10 minutes thinking I was going to learn something else about this interesting article that I started with? This is human behavior. Daniel Forrester wrote a great book called Consider, Harnessing the Power of Reflective Thinking in Your Organization and basically in your lives. I think boards are a great opportunity for reflective thinking. And one of the premises of this book is that in the commodity, daily lives, there are 4 commodities that we have in our lives: data, distraction, attention, and meaning. Guess which ones are free? Data and distraction. They are available for free. You can get all the data and distraction you want. Sometimes I think we can't get enough. We love it. Attention and meaning are costly. To stop and focus your attention costs you something. And beyond that, making meaning costs something more because you have to actually spend time thinking. Time is costly, and yet it's critical. Boards, at their best, help organizations focus attention and make meaning together. Absolutely critical. Now, I heard Forrester speak again. I've heard him a couple of times. He's great. And one thing that I learned about, that he talked about a couple of weeks ago when he spoke, was an article actually in Science, the journal Science. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it was reported in the LA Times, and it's called Left Alone with Their Thoughts, People Choose Electric Shock. Really? Yes. So they started off doing this test with college students, and they put them in a room, and they said nothing except sit there with your thoughts. You don't have a cell phone, you have nothing. There's a clock on the wall, that's it. Sit there and think. After 6 minutes, they were going crazy. Very few could make it to 12 minutes. And so they said, okay, maybe it's the lab where we have them. Try this at home. They didn't do any better at home. Then they thought, maybe it's just college students, let's face it. Short attention spans, whatever. So they decided to invite other people into these studies. People aged from 17 to 87. What they found was, people chose, okay, so then they decided to up the ante, not just sitting alone, but let's put a little device in there that if they wanted to just kind of give themselves something to do, they could give themselves an electric shock. I love the psychologists who think up these studies, right? People choose to electrically shock themselves rather than be alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes. I know some of you are going, I would, wouldn't you? Okay, you guys are going to love this. A full 67% of men who previously rated the shocks as unpleasant, so unpleasant they would pay to avoid them, still chose to zap themselves at least once during the 12-minute period. Guys, really? 67%. Only 27% of the women did. But still, like, so there's some gender difference. They try to explain that later, which is kind of funny, but one man shocked himself 190 times. And I love that the study says he was considered an outlier. Really? Oh my gosh. So, isn't this fascinating? Human behavior. They tried to say that the gender difference is probably due to the tendency for men to be higher in sensation seeking. I think that was a man who said that, but anyway. Point being, we are interesting beings, aren't we? I mean, it's just kind of freaky. And then I started, we were actually talking about this over drinks one evening, and I think I might shock myself once, just to see what it was like. But anyway, in terms of boards, you really got to, you got a lot of people, sometimes 50, 60, 70, maybe some of you are smaller, sitting around the table. Think about the individual thoughts that are going on there, and would people rather shock themselves than be in the board meeting? I don't know. I love this. We live in a society bloated with data but starved for wisdom. And that's at the heart of this. Data's everywhere. Where's the wisdom? Best boards bring on wisdom. They move the organization from data to information to knowledge to wisdom. And in this hierarchy or way of thinking, data means you know nothing. It's basically just that. It's data. It's nothing. Doesn't mean anything. Information means you know what. Knowledge means you know how. Wisdom means you know why. In simple terms, as you think moving up from knowing nothing to knowing what, to knowing how, to knowing why. Absolutely essential to great governance in our organizations. It's a great quote by Colin Powell, and it says, "First tell me what you know, then tell me what you don't know, and only then tell me what you think." And that's something that he said to his advisors, and I think that's really beautiful. Tell me what you know. And for boards, think about in this discussion situation or this decision situation, what do we know? What do we not know? What's knowable about what we don't know yet, and what will remain unknowable, and then let's figure out what we think about that. That's critical thinking. That's essential to great governance. Okay, another issue with great governance or impediment to boards doing better is most of us don't like ambiguity. In fact, studies have shown that we prefer risk to ambiguity. Why? With risk, you actually have some idea about probabilities of outcomes. You have some idea about probabilities of outcomes. You can assign, okay, I'm going to take a risk, but I got a 50-50 shot, or an 80-20 shot. With ambiguity, you don't know. You can't assign probabilities to outcomes. So most of us avoid ambiguity at all costs. However, it's also been said that we live right now in a VUCA world. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. How's that for your daily lives? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. This is part of what we have to deal with. And so the best boards actually embrace ambiguity with their executive director to have tough conversations when things are messy. Another impediment to great governance is instant gratification. This is also part of our world, right? And it's not just children. But a lot of us don't have tolerance for things that take time. Good governance doesn't happen overnight. You can't just go back and say, oh, I heard this speaker, let's go try this. I'll talk about that one in just a second. But to just say, why can't we just flip a switch and be better boards? Forget about it. Because we're all humans. And trying to make all those humans come together into a productive collective is challenging. So here's my, heard this speaker, let's try this. We have a fascination with shiny objects. So the next thing, the next trend. I heard about a theater that's doing this, let's try that. I heard about, this, all right, our competitor's doing this, maybe we should as well. Well, it might work in that setting, it might not work for you. You need to have a conversation about it and try some things, but not just be fascinated by that next shiny object. Great boards actually help the organizations confront values and beliefs. And with the art that you do, right, what's considered risky, what's considered, state of the art? Do we want to do something more traditional? Whatever those things may be, you are confronting values and beliefs that people have in your communities, people have among the actors, among the people in your organizations. And this is messy. So part of this particular slide comes from the work of Ron Heifetz, Leadership Without Easy Answers. It's a really great book for leaders. He wrote another one more recently called Adaptive Leadership. And at the heart of adaptive leadership is actually understanding the difference between technical problems and adaptive challenges. Technical problems in our organizations can be solved by the staff. And maybe we have some board expertise that we invite in to deal with some of those. But where you want to spend time as a board is in the adaptive challenges, the tough, messy, VUCA stuff that your theaters are facing. Adaptive challenges are where values and beliefs come into play. And this is really at the heart of your missions because they're based on values and beliefs that you have. So leadership in this setting consists of not having the right answer, but of having a conversation that reveals what people think. And we're going to help you do that. We're going to practice after the break a little bit about asking questions rather than asserting answers. Okay? Resist the temptation to have the right answer. And this is challenging for our executive directors because oftentimes boards look to the executive director to have the answers. That's why we hired you. That's what we're paying you for. And yet, if there were easy answers, first of all, you wouldn't need a board, right? You could just, and then also if it's an easy answer situation, that's not what you want your executive director bringing to the board anyway. What we want is challenging, substantive issues. Okay, final impediment to governing differently or great governance is that critical thinking is hard. I love this quote from Henry Ford. Can you read that in the back? Thinking is the hardest work there is, which is probably the reason so few of us engage in it. I love this one from Einstein. It's not that I'm so smart, it's that I stay with problems longer. I stay with problems longer. How many of us like to stay in a problem? This is part of what happens with boards. We have a propensity to act. We come together, we're having a board meeting. Aren't we supposed to show up and make decisions? Give us something to vote on. You know, I'm ready to say aye. I just can't wait. And then you can go home. Now, you know, it's one of our reasons boards are, they show up, but they don't really do much. They're not sure what they're supposed to do. Part of great governance is staying with problems longer. And what I mean by that is finding together the right problems, framing them, talking about how we see them. They can be problems, they can be opportunities. We're going to talk about this in the context of capitalization in just a minute. So stay in that uncomfortable space longer. Einstein also said, I love this one, if I had but an hour to save the world, I'd spend 59 minutes defining the problem. Think about that. Why? Because if you define the problem wrong, you're gone anyway. Spend your time thinking about the problem. And somebody else said, and I forget who it was, but a problem well stated is over half solved. Once you've kind of clarified the problem or opportunity and how the organization wants to deal with it, that's a lot of the work. That's great work for boards with the staff. Stay in that time longer. Have dialogues at board meetings. I'm going to give you a lot of best practices of ways to do this as we go forward. Here's a Churchill that I just found that I like. We have run out of money, now we have to think. Okay, that's so appropriate, right? Cash and culture.
Wow.
Yeah, powerful.
Wow.
Scary, right? This happened at Harvard a couple years ago. Brilliant people on the corporation, which is the Harvard's board, decided, let's do an engineering building. Like nobody can do an engineering building except Harvard, Science and Engineering Technology, over in Alston Park campus, beautiful, dug a hole sat there for a long time. Because, and I know we don't feel sorry for Harvard's endowment, $34 billion endowment, tanked, along with everything else. 55% of arts and sciences budget at Harvard was tied to its endowment. When that tanked, that hurt. Salary freezes, people were let go, nobody was hired, and we had this hole in the ground. So really smart people, how could that happen? So let's not wait till we run out of money before we think, which is part of this conference, which is so exciting. Okay, so what challenges are ahead of your theater, your organization? What are some of the challenges ahead? Anyone? This is the time for the group couch. Yes?
Aging audiences.
Aging audiences. How many of you would agree that's one? Aging audiences. Yeah. They are, you're loyal. A lot of your loyal, the folks that have been coming, right, to the theater, they're getting older. What's going to happen to them? How are we going to keep them engaged? Are they going to die? And will we have... Now, I know in museums, that's always a good thing. A friend of mine did a session, and Chuck Loring, you might know him. He talks about fundraising, but it was called The Grateful Dead. And in between was Grateful Bear Dead. Anyway. But aging folks, yes.
Worry about another market downturn.
Another market downturn. Yeah, can we take it? Things have been going along pretty good, and there are people who say, not just the doomsayers, we're not going to sustain this. It could take another dive. What else?
Competition for people's attention.
Competition for people's attention. We just talked about that. And people there's a lot of things people can do with whatever free time they find other than shocking themselves, right? So competition for people's attention. How do we get their attention? How do we get them engaged? There's a lot of things they can do. What else?
This is kind of the converse of what was said before, because I don't worry so much about older audiences, because they're always replenishing themselves. It's more about attracting a younger audience.
Okay, attracting, well, not worrying so much about the older audiences because they keep replenishing themselves, but attracting younger audiences. Every single nonprofit out there, every single organization is, well, how are we going to get these millennials and whoever's coming behind the millennials, which are actually the ultimate multitaskers. These people think they can multitask like nobody's business just because they've grown up in a digital age. They're not any better at it. But how are we going to get, what do younger generations want? What else? Yes?
Succession planning.
Succession planning for your staff
And the board.
and the board. Yeah, so turnover. Some of us need some turnover on our boards. What's the right mix though? How often do people go off the board and get new ones on? And who are those new people going to be? What else?
Yeah, lack of education in schools so that you don't get people who are automatically interested in your art form.
Okay. You're not getting this in schools necessarily, so that people are coming up from the schools interested in your art form. What
Along
else?
with that, I want to say navigating the school board, because there's no support anymore for bringing art to kids in any form or fashion.
Navigating the school board because there's no support anymore for bringing art together with kids, like there used to be. That's a huge issue. What else?
Changing philanthropic behavior.
Changing philanthropic behavior, meaning,
People are giving to different things than they used to with different strengths of staff.
yeah, people are giving to different things. And Ice Bucket Challenge, I mean, look what that did for ALS. But everybody's looking for their next Ice Bucket Challenge now. Like, wow, I wish we could come up with one of those. And then now they're saying there's no way because it's been done. Right? So, interesting. What else?
Static location that limits growth.
Static location limits growth. It's part of your capitalization issue in terms of your physical capital, your physical space. We are limited, most of us, in that. What else?
Engagement with a live experience.
Lack of engagement with a live experience. People even want that anymore, right? Because they can get all the excitement they want on YouTube or whatever. What do we want to do in terms of live experience? One more?
Diversity and inclusion.
Diversity and inclusion. And I like that you said inclusion. It's not just about diversity. You know, it used to be that's kind of what we talk about, diversity. We were really talking about inclusion. So you have maybe diversity, but it wasn't inclusive. And we need to be thinking about that. And what does that mean? So, none of these has an easy answer, panacea, silver bullet, right? None of these issues that you just brought up. That's why we need great boards working with great staff. Basically, board members just want to know the answer to this question. You know who those two are in the back, right? Because they're on your board. Grousing in the back. But truly, that's what we want to know. Are we making an impact? So this framework for exceptional governance came out in 2005, this book called Governance as Leadership, Reframing the Work of Nonprofit Boards, my colleagues Chait, Ryan, and Taylor. And this is my shameless self-promotion. You can buy the book out there for only $39. The Practitioner's Guide to Governance as Leadership, which was the how-to guide. So did anybody read Governance as Leadership? Okay, it's a great book, wasn't it? Or like Dick said, my colleague Dick Chait has been my good friend and colleague and mentor forever. He said, you know, once you put it down, you can't pick it up. It's fabulous. It gave us a great... Yeah, Dick, you know, and some of you may have seen Dick because he's spoken many places. The basic premise is that it's not so much about boards underperforming, and performance isn't necessarily the issue because what's the issue is purpose. If we gave boards a higher purpose and they were doing more meaningful work in the boardroom, performance would rise. In other words, you'll get what you ask for from your board to a certain degree, assuming you start to get the right people around the table. And you're going to get the right people around the table to the extent that you actually engage them at board meetings in meaningful work. So the Practitioner's Guide was to say, okay, some of it was kind of academic, you know, it was like, oh, this is kind of hard to wrap my head around. And so I wrote the Practitioner's Guide to help boards actually have steps, step by step, how do you do this work? The basic idea behind it is great boards Discern, define, deliberate, and decides issues that matter to the organizations. In a sentence, that's what they do. They discern, define, deliberate, and then decide. Now, there's a lot packed into that sentence. It requires, first of all, asking great questions. Boards need to ask great questions, and staff members need to bring to the board table great questions, not prepackaged solutions. That doesn't get us very far in this adaptive challenge world, this VUCA world that we talked about. The way we used to govern, with you had some nice volunteers with a lot of money, those days are over. We can't continue our theaters, our important work with governance as usual. So great questions. It requires that, so questions help us discern what's going on. Framing helps us define what's going on. So think about a frame around a picture. What does it do? Focuses your attention. What else? Yes?
Limits the object.
It limits it. It says what's in and what's out. Puts parameters around it. Great boards do that with their organizations. They frame. How do we want to look at this? How do we want to delimit this? What are we going to do and not do? Requires critical thinking, which we've talked a little bit about. It requires airing and understanding divergent views. This gets into the quality of thinking, the diverse ways of thinking in the room that we mentioned earlier. Airing and understanding divergent views before we converge on a solution. That's the deliberation. This is hard work. I'm going to give you some steps on how to do it. It requires great insight, and this says consequences just ahead. When boards go through this, they actually make better decisions, which is ultimately what we're after. Basic idea that there's 3 mental maps or mindsets of boards. What we're most used to is the fiduciary aspect of what we do, right? That's the productive part of our organizations. Your job as a board is to protect the assets of the organization. But our boards are also logical. They have a strategic component. That means we're thinking about strategic plans. We're thinking about where are we, where do we want to be. But organizations are much more than that. They're also expressive. This is the generative piece. This is where we actually are defining the future, where we're thinking about our mission in light of the future. When we're thinking about mission risk, not just strategic risk or financial risk. Okay, so a triangle is one way to think about 3 mindsets. Here's another picture. I think in terms of pictures, I like this one also from their book because it looks at generative as sense-making, strategic as direction, and fiduciary as execution. And think of that stream, see that stream there, that line? The opportunity for the board to have an insightful conversation where they bring wisdom to the table is way upstream at the headwaters of decision-making. Way upstream at the headwaters of decision-making. That's the framing piece, where we're still trying to figure this out, where the executive director brings a tough question into the room. What are we going to do about the aging audience? How are we going to engage younger audiences? Do people want to interact with humans anymore? What's that going to mean to us? We are physically located in one spot. How can we turn that into an opportunity? Or can we rethink space? You can take some lessons outside of your industry, for example, art museums, and how they're using space, and how they're thinking about that, and how people want to interact with art anymore. Do they really want to come into the physical space and look at pictures on the wall? Or are there other ways to interact with what you do? So those are the sense-making questions. What's fascinating about this, not just from a theoretical point of view, but from human behavior point of view, is this sense-making is what we all do. We all do it as individuals every single day of our lives. We do it in the boardroom, but we never had a name for it. And we never gave it much attention, and yet it's absolutely essential to great governance. Because boards figure we're here as fiduciaries. We've got to look at the budget. We've got to approve things like that. We've got to think about our assets. And yes, capitalization is really important, but there's more to it than that. So how many of us go into let's say you go into an office in the morning, I don't know if you do, but you go to your workplace. Do you just get there and say, I'm here now, bring me decisions to make? I'm here. Decisions, bring them to me. This is what happens in boards. And yet, it's crazy. No, when you go to your office, if you're not, once you get your coffee, right, that's what you need, your electric shock is your coffee, you sense make first. You open we used to have an inbox, we used to have, little pink, remember those little pink things so-and-so called while you were out? This is how old I am, and young people are going, what? Yes, and we had paper where we put down a phone number, so-and-so called. No one even calls anymore. It's like, I worked in an office at Harvard for a while, and people would send me an email that were right next door, I'm like, why don't you just come down? My door is open, come talk to me. But anyway, we make sense first. You go through your emails. Maybe you go out and talk to people, because what you're doing is seeing what's going on. You're taking in information. You're sense-making before decision-making. Boards need to do that too. It's absolutely essential. That's part of what's behind this theory. So boards add value getting up that stream from oversight to inquiry, from planning to thinking to framing, by just asking different sets of questions. Different question to ask, do we have a clean audit? What are the insights from the audit? It's a higher level question, right? And yet most of us only ask, do we have a clean audit? Higher level question. What's the plan? What's the idea? In strategic planning to strategic thinking. What's the size of the markets? What are the new markets? Higher order, planning to thinking. And then there's a whole host of generative questions, and we're going to practice after the break to get some practice thinking in these three modes. Does this idea align with or change our mission? When should we revisit our mission? Who are the key stakeholders in this conversation, and what's at stake for them? If boards aren't asking those questions with their staff, you've got a problem, because it's not automatic. What you want to try to get out there is, what are people's assumptions? Why do we think these are the key stakeholders in this conversation? If we do this, what will they say about us? What will they say that we value? How else might we look at this? Best executive directors, actually, they know what they think. They want to learn what their board thinks. And so they might even present something, but then say, what did I miss? How else could we look at this? Or before they present something, they bring a critical question to the board and say, what do you think? Before they assert what they think. Think about the difference between saying, I think, and I'm thinking. Very powerful. Because once we say, I think this, as a board member or as a staff member, we've kind of put a stake in the ground. When you're still thinking, you're still open. Think, do that thinking, do that framing before decision making. This slide just summarizes this, and I want to draw your attention to, this isn't magical. It's about providing oversight, foresight, and insight. It might be this triangle or that slope that helps you think about the framework, but these are ways we think anyway. The roles of the board, remember we said at the outset, sometimes boards don't understand their roles and responsibility. Your roles are pretty simple. You're stewards, you're strategists, and you're sense makers. The problem was that for a long time in most of our boards, we didn't allow to be sense makers and strategists. We just wanted them to be good stewards. Now, a lot of us are really good at that work, and that's great. We want that technical expertise from our board members and our staff members, but we also want more. We want them thinking through. And when you look at the areas of risk at the fiduciary level is financial failure. Risk at the strategic level is apathy and slow death. That's that mediocrity space. The risk at your mission level is your very relevance. Your very relevance. That's powerful, right? So think about that. And most of us, our brains work in all these different ways if we allow them to. If we create the space for that. And I also like on there the ways of knowing. In fiduciary work, it stands to reason. In strategic work, the pieces all fit. I should say pieces, not piece. And in generative, it makes sense. Different ways of knowing. So you think about the different ways people think, why we want diversity. This helps you give a framework to that. Generative governance is not some magical, mystical thing, which is what, when the book first came out, Governance is Leadership, people thought, oh, they scratch their head, what is that? We'll never be able to do that. Basically, it's this. The board is generating insight and understanding around some issue, opportunity, or problem, and how do we want to deal with it as an organization that takes advantage of our culture, our way of responding. So there are 5 indicators of what we call a triple helix that you should probably, whoops, how did I do that? I just kept pushing buttons, it happens. When you want to try to think about when something's really a messy, critical issue or adaptive challenge, some of the ones you listed right before, they have these characteristics. They're ambiguous, they're salient, that is, they matter to people. They matter to different stakeholders, and you better understand those stakeholders' views on it. Oftentimes there's strife around the issue. It's conflict. It's not a simple solution. Somebody's going to get upset, somebody's going to be happy, and you've got to deal with that. Stakes are high, and the issue, it's irreversible. You don't get a do-over. Okay, you don't get a, oops, we shouldn't have done that. You know, you just invested in a production or something. It's out there. You don't get to do it over. So that's a good time to have a different kind of conversation in the boardroom. So we think about capitalization, which I love, as a triple helix. I think in terms of money, markets, and mission. Right? Cash and culture, money, markets, and mission, those 3 parts of this. You'll be talking this afternoon about getting beyond break even, but under capitalization, and the article talked about the fact that being undercapitalized is very distracting and debilitating. Talk about, you know, taking your attention off of things, even though it's absolutely critical, it's distracting, and it can be debilitating. It chills artistic risk-taking, and I wish I could have heard your speaker last night, because he sounded fabulous, so fabulous. Wow, what a talent, right? But that's part of what we want to do. We have to understand in our theaters risk. What are the risks we're willing to take? How do we look at risk in our organization? How do we look at it from a money, market, and mission standpoint? So it fits this triple helix idea perfectly. Failure. Failure is the ultimate risk to your mission. Right? You're gone. You're out of business. There is no greater risk to your mission. The article also talks about focusing on break even can neglect the balance sheet. So you need to build net assets and funds through significant surpluses. Failure to size the market appropriately and miscommunication and fear of failure are all part of this. Yeah. But that article was fabulous. You'll be doing some more of that this afternoon. I liked this particular quote from this piece. Many organizations are trying to find a response to the impact of rapid change in audience behavior and the crowded field of cultural opportunities. For many, the lack of access to risk or working capital stymies their ability to fully define the problem. It is a marketing issue, a product problem, or a question of relevance to mission. So how do we even want to define the problem? Think about that in light of what I've said this morning so far. That's the conversation you want to have with your board. Staying in that problem definition moment. How do we want to see it? Marketing, product, question of mission. What are the other things that come to mind? It might not even be one of those. Thinking about that in different ways will take you further along the path. And then, what's our response going to be? Your response at your theater isn't going to be the same response necessarily as another theater, because you've got your culture and your community to think about, your stakeholders to think about that. But this is a really powerful moment today for you to start to do that. At the heart of generative thinking, then, is this idea of thinking about this. And the article went on to talk about 3 groups that they saw in terms of weathering the recession. So one group is the rainy day for which they are prudently prepared. They have options. Their core mission will emerge intact. Okay, that's one group. Second, profound impact on the organization's growth and development. May have to forego certain dreams or things that they want to do until things get better. But the third group, a recession will break the camel's back. And everything would need to be on the table. Repositioning, merger, bankruptcy. So I don't know which group your theater might be in, and you're thinking this through some more this afternoon. But the key question is, which of these realities is yours? Okay. If the key stakeholders are not in agreement about the organization's reality, it is impossible to have an honest conversation about workable solutions. So first, you've got to be able to have a generative conversation with the board about how we see our situation. And we need to know the different aspects to that. We need to understand the financial aspects and the strategic aspects of the situation so that we can have that conversation. Because if you don't agree at that high level, then solutions won't work. That's kind of the bottom line here. So if you assume the wrong reality, end up making completely inappropriate decisions that do nothing but stave off the day of reckoning a little further. If you can agree together on the correct reality, even if it's ugly, there's hope. So this way of thinking is designed to help you have those conversations when you go back and with those of you who are here together. And you'll be thinking about action steps going forward. So I just wanted to kind of frame up where we're going and what we'll practice on. I want to give you some steps before we take a break to exceptional governance. And they are these. There are 6 of them. I'm going to go through each one of them and give you some highlights on that. So the first one, find, frame, and focus on what matters most. Now I'm going backwards. Ah. My favorite cartoons have no words, you know? Isn't that awesome?
That's great.
So I'm going to tell a little funny story too right now, because I think it's time when people are like, yeah, that was a lot coming at me. My brain is full. So this is called emergent strategy, which I love. But if you, this was another study that was done, and actually has to do with the bathrooms at Heathrow Airport, the men's rooms at Heathrow Airport. Anybody been through Heathrow? You guys, you know, maybe a few years ago. Well, what they were finding is the bathrooms were kind of messy by the urinals, right? Kind of sticky, icky, yucky. And so what they did was I don't know who they are, but they put a little red dot. Guys are going, yeah! We would also shock ourselves, so you know. And so this little red dot in the bottom of all the urinals, guess what? Guess what? Target! So any of you have little boys or have little boys in your life? Cheerios. This is a use for Cheerios, right? I learned this too from people who, you put Cheerios and the little boy learns how to, you know, aim at something. So, but it works for adults too. I'm just saying. So women, we laugh, but you know what? I would aim at it too if that's, you know, I'm just, you know, we learn. So, my point about what she's going to know, this has got to do with anything. If we give them a target, they will aim at it. So you better pick the right target. So this is my lesson for governance. Talk about your target. Select together the right target, okay? It's not just that, and it's not, once you provide one, that's where people are going to go. So let's make sure, that goes back to that slide, let's make sure we're having the right conversation. I love this quote, if you boarded the wrong train, it's no use running along the corridor the opposite direction. Yes, I am going to admit, so I'm from Iowa. I spent 30 years in Iowa, and you know, I did get to the big city one time first, and you know, get on the wrong train. And I didn't really do this, but I kind of thought about it. Anyway, this is so critical to finding, framing, and focusing on what matters, and having that conversation, that paying attention and making meaning conversation. So, finding, framing, and focusing means that boards need to spend more time upstream on that. Remember that diagram? Actually talking about how do we see the issue of capitalization in our organization? How do we see the issue of risk and risk-taking? How are we going to deal with the ambiguity around these issues? Because they are ambiguous. consider the different stakeholders. That will help you. If you think about different stakeholders and their lenses. Wear trifocals, meaning think about, that's one way to think about these is 3 different lenses. You know, if you have, mine are bifocals, but you have something up close, something mid-range, something longer term. Thinking in those 3 ways. You can think about it, I like the idea, the notion of a prism. This is kind of like a prism. One board that I worked with, they bring kaleidoscopes with them to their board meetings. They had little kaleidoscopes they gave everyone because it's like, if we just turn this a little bit, we see this differently. So I thought was a really interesting way to think about this. And so that helps them keep that in their frame of mind. You know what if we looked at it this way? I see a different picture. So keep the focus on the main thing. It was Barksdale, the Intel CEO, who said the main thing is to make sure the main thing is the main thing. That was the secret of success. Or no, it's Netscape actually. Main thing was to make sure the main thing is actually the main thing. Avoid diagnosis momentum. So are there any doctors in the house? Some of you might know when you go to a doctor, what do? They ask you a set of questions, hopefully. They listen carefully. They take some diagnostics, so they're getting some data. What happens then? Diagnosis, right? And then what happens? Treatment. If the diagnosis is wrong, this goes back to what I said earlier. Try to ensure that with your board, you spend more time in the diagnostics. Stay in the problem longer. The old Einstein quote. Spend 59 minutes figuring out what you're talking about. 1 minute solving it, basically. Okay? Avoid diagnosis momentum, because once something's diagnosed in the medical profession, it takes on a life of its own. And this is why in medicine we get a second or third opinion. In governance, we don't. We roll with it. So sometimes you have a really strong board member, maybe it's a big donor, maybe it's a very outspoken person, maybe it's a boardroom lion who has all the right answers, and they take us right there. I know what this is, I know the answer. Yeah, okay. Well, we need to sometimes, wait, let's step back from that. You go, yeah, that's me. So yeah, there's one, yeah, that's me. Question, step back. If you have a board member like that, sometimes you can ask that person to argue with themselves. I love that. I love that. Okay, we got it. You said it. You said it 5 times and you said it louder each time. And you even pounded your fist on the table to make sure we understood what you thought. Say, okay, how might a reasonable person argue with what you just said? Argue with yourself. Take the counter argument. Push your own thinking. Usually it shuts them up pretty quickly. But what sometimes it does is open them up and say, oh yeah, you know what? Maybe this could be something else. And let's have that kind of dialogue. Decide what to discuss and what to decide and when to do it. Not all your board meetings have to be a decision moment. You should spend some time discussing stuff separate and apart from decision making and try to map that out in these rolling 12-month discussion and decision agendas. There are some things that are fiduciary that you know your board has to do, and every February you have to approve a budget or whatever the case may be. You can put that on your calendar. But then also put some deep dive conversations around critical issues on your calendar. These are the 3 things that we want to take up in really serious fashion in dialogue with our board throughout the year. Better than a business model, I have a business scheme. Can you read that in the back? I love Dover. So the idea, and this came up as one of the issues, I think at your board chair meeting this morning, but one of your issues also in the survey was our committee structure. How are we structured? And are we kind of stagnant because of our structure? So I know so many boards that committee, and they're self-perpetuating, and they just keep meeting even though they really haven't done much. They haven't decided anything of importance for some time, but they keep meeting because they're supposed to. And lots of times then they think they have something they better report to the board because they met. Well, a different way of thinking about that is examine your standing committees. What's the most important decision or work that the standing committee made last year? Or the most important couple of things they did last year? And what do we see for them this year? What's the work ahead? Set goals for your standing committees. And then rethink them and make sure that your strategy drives your structure, not vice versa. So in other words, if we do have a strategic plan, or we're thinking through that, either it's stagnant or we need a new one, well, what might that mean then to our board structure? How do we ensure that the board is having critical conversations around things that are really important? This gets into the idea of task forces or ad hoc groups. That can be a way to engage different members of your community in a different kind of conversation. People love task forces as opposed to standing committees. Why? It has an end. Everybody said that in unison. It ends. Oh. You know, you set the task and you're clear about the task, so the task force has a goal. Here's what we're supposed to do. You get the people on there that care about the task, and then gratefully it comes to an end because they present some recommendations to the board or have a conversation with the board, and then you get to move on to the next fun thing. So think about your structure more like that. What's the fiduciary work you absolutely have to do for which you need a standing committee? You know, I'm not saying blow up your audit committee or your finance committee. Those things are essential. Your investments committee, your advancement committee, very important. But maybe you have a task force that goes along with one of those or a subset of one of those. That's a task force to think about specific issues that come forward. More adhocracy, strategy-driven, outcomes-oriented. And you can engage different people differently if you do that. So that's one technique. Heavens, don't sit there. Everyone who's ever sat there has died of boredom. Meetings. None of us is as dumb as all of us. So this is a great website that you can go to at the break or whenever. It's called despair.com. And it takes these inspirational quotes you see on organization, these wonderful posters they have, the coffee mugs. They do that and they make fun of these inspirational quotes. This is one of my favorites, so I love despair.com. So what we want to do is have better meetings through a culture of inquiry. That means actually having goals and objectives for your board meeting. Can you imagine? Why are we meeting? It's not, you're not going to write your objective is to read a series of reports to board members. Think about it, and yet that's what we do. So if you actually, right? That would be your goal. No, your goal is to engage these people in thinking on critical issues with you. And so when you think about it that way, you fit your format for your meeting to what we're trying to achieve. You're thinking more thematically instead of report-driven. Now maybe there is a report from the finance person, our business officer, and we need to have that, but we read it in advance, and what comes with that report is a set of critical questions. Maybe even one critical question that the finance person wants to take up with the board. Okay, you read my report, here's something I'm grappling with. This can be the executive director. You read my report. And executive directors always want to tell their board the good stuff that's happening in the organization, and sweetness and light. I've had people say, well, our board meetings are dog and pony shows, but they only trot out the pretty ponies. And yet the board should be talking about what's keeping the executive director awake at night. What's that person struggling with? That's why you want this, remember, competitive advantage, strategic asset, think tank in the boardroom with you. Substitute all that other stuff for high value activity and conversation by creating efficiencies. Let board members know the goals of the meeting and what we need from them. Here's what we want you to read in advance. We're not going to inundate you with a huge, dose of data and distract you with that. I worked with a hospital board. They had 3 reminders. I didn't even know they made them this thick, It's like, really? You expect busy people to wade through all of that and figure out what's important? They can't do it. So different ways you can, performance dashboards, quick reports, seek feedback from your executive director. How's this going? Are we governing or are we just talking? And summarize the implications of a board meeting and the expectations of the next steps. So often we're like, we're out of time, we gotta go. And people roll out of the room and they come back at the next meeting and, sometimes they forgot what they were doing, right? There's a time for a Nietzsche quote. The most common form of human stupidity is forgetting what we were trying to do. And we do that in words. Well, what were we trying to do anyway? So, the meeting's at 10. I'll send you a copy of the agenda, the hidden agenda, and your personal agenda. Classic, right? Okay, now that we all agree let's all go back to our desks and say why this won't work. So that's the board meeting in the parking lot after the meeting, right? Never happens. No, never. Parking lot meeting. This is why we want to ensure. Did you want a picture of that? So I know. I know it's, when people say, can you share your PowerPoint presentation? I can share all the content slides, and I have. I can't share the cartoons, so that's all anybody really wants. So the cartoons, I don't have copyright permission to actually give you those, but you can have all the content slides. So the idea here is to ensure robust discourse in your meeting, not after the meeting. And the way you do that is to have broad participation and constructive dissent. This quote you probably can't read in the back. This is from Alfred P. Sloan as GM chairman and CEO, and he said this: I take it we're all in agreement with the decision here. Then I propose that we postpone further discussion to give ourselves time to develop disagreement and possibly gain some understanding about this decision. So when he saw everybody around the table just nodding, he would table the vote. Now, you could say, yeah, you can do that in a corporation. I said you can do that in nonprofits too. Wait. We're all in agreement that may be great, and maybe that's what you want, but have we actually heard dissent before we get to agreement? Have we heard divergent views? Have we let people say what they think? And some of those techniques were back on this slide. I have some more techniques on this slide. Distribute discussion questions in advance so people have time to think before they speak. It's a novel thought. Think outside of remember, critical thinking takes time. We got to spend some time with the issues. So send up those questions in advance. We're going to take this, we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour at our board meeting dialoguing about X. Here's the question we want you to think about. And here's some information about that question. Minimize staff presentations so that you actually have time. And I gave you a technique to do that. Put the question, not the, let people read that in advance. Pose meaningful questions as catalysts to kind of critical thinking. Entertain what-if scenarios. Some boards I've worked with, they actually do now, they do best case scenario, worst case scenario, and most likely case. And they don't just talk about that, but they say why. What are the assumptions that support best case, worst case, and most likely? Why? Getting to wisdom. Why do we think this is most likely? And what would we have to do to move to the best case scenario? Different set of questions. Vary the format of your meetings. Have breakout groups. We're going to do this after the break. We're going to be working at our tables in breakout groups around a really fun activity. I think you'll enjoy it. Have advocacy panels. We're going to have half the board advocate for X and half the board advocate for Y. And maybe you actually like X better, but you have to advocate for Y. You can do anonymous input. This one is fabulous technique. All these are spelled out in the book. Anonymous input. Anybody ever do this at a board meeting? You actually have index cards around the table. Everybody's got an index card in front of them, and you pose a critical question. Simple question. It could be something like this. What percentage of our board meeting, typical board meeting time is put to good use? Write a percentage down on your index card. Anybody? It could be 0 to 100%. Then you shuffle them. You shuffle them. And then you get them up in front. What it does is you separate source from substance. Nobody knows who said what. It could be a controversial issue. It could be something you can tell people aren't really saying what they think. They're afraid to. That was one of our reasons boards underperform. Have them write it down. Write down your thought on an index card, and then we're going to shuffle them. Now, everybody has skin in the game. Everybody's involved in that, but you don't know who said what, so it's safe, creating that safe space to say what you think. Then what's so revealing is you read everybody reads off what's on their card, and you start to lump them into themes. Hopefully you're not going to have 50 different things up there. But you can start to map out, here's what our board actually thinks. We didn't know that until we asked them to write it down anonymously because we were only hearing from the usual suspects, or people were afraid to talk. Silent start. This is the one where you pose a question and you let everybody think before anybody says a word. Let people think before somebody jumps in. Remember, diagnosis, no momentum. First person out of the box. They're going to start us down a train of thought. 1-minute memos. If we had 1 more minute, what would you have liked to have said? Case studies, hypotheticals, debates, all these are different ways. Constituent views. Let's role play. I know, role play. Oh, you should like that. We're theaters. Right? Because some boards look at me like I have 3 heads if I say role play. I'm a CEO, I don't role play. Role plays are great. If you're thinking about your key stakeholders, let's huddle up. Your older traditional theater goers. And here's the scenario, what are you going to think about it? You're, Gen X, and you kind of want to get involved. Your curators, whatever the case may be, production managers, whatever the case may be, role play the situation so you get the different viewpoints out. Very effective, different kind of dialogue. Here's your executive director on any given day. Now, one CEO said to me, oh, I like that, they're cheering me on. That's one way to look at it. Either that or they're engaged and they're all yelling different things to you. You're just trying to roll, right? Here's my favorite despair.com. Dysfunction. The only consistent feature of all your dissatisfying relationships is you. I worked with a board recently, and at one of the breaks, this guy comes up and he's like, and he'd been like, totally grumpy, the whole time. Just kind of one of those people you love. And I just want to say, I'm on 5 boards and they all suck. And I said, really? Imagine that. So, building the board as a team is really essential, and this goes back to what you said earlier. We don't have the right skill set, we don't have the right people on the board. You need to build the board as a team. Thinking about board succession is really critical. So it helps to build a board as a team. No high-performing team doesn't understand its goal. And yet with boards, I don't think they know what they're supposed to be doing. That goes back to some of the things we said at the outset. They don't know their roles and responsibility. They're not educated. What are we supposed to be doing here? They don't understand the mission. We need to have a clear, compelling, shared purpose. One way to do that is to ask your board, what do you want the board that meets 5 years from now to say this board did? What legacy? I love that. It's a great exercise. What do we want our legacy to be? Now, we don't want it to be what, that we decided the gala this year would be, or the color scheme would be. Really? Nobody says, and yet that's where we spend too much time sometimes, right? No, what do we want our legacy to be? So determine your board's mission, not just your organization's mission, but if this is our board's legacy, what do we have to do to fulfill it? What is our board's mission? It's a great dialogue. Set clear, compelling, consequential goals for the board. Best boards actually have annual goals. These are the goals for the board. They work with the board chair and the executive director to say, what do we need from our board this year? We're going to set those goals. And then you can set committee and task force goals that derive from that. Avoid groupthink through appropriate deliberation. We've talked about that. How to get multiple views heard in the boardroom. State trustee expectations. Some boards actually have a code of conduct. These are our expectations. Williams College does this. They do this through a really funny Q&A, and they give it to all new board members. One of the questions is, can I look at my electronic device during board meetings? And they have a no device zone. But the answer is, how do you feel when you're speaking and people are looking at their device? That's their answer. Leave it. They had to make them leave them in boxes outside the boardroom to break themselves of it, but now they bring them in, but they just know they're not supposed to use them. One of the questions is, who are those 3 really old guys that always sit in the back of the room? And the answer is, those are emeritus trustees, and they're really important to the life of Williams College. So they have some fun with it. How much am I expected to give? They have really serious questions about, like, what do I do if I'm contacted by a member of the press? And they tell them what they're supposed to do. What if an angry faculty member comes up to me and knows I'm on the board and makes their case, and they have an answer of how they're supposed to deal with it? So Q&A, like that, code of conduct. Get to know each other personally. You're building bonds of social trust. This gets into social capital. I mentioned political capital, I mentioned financial capital, and intellectual capital. The other one is social capital. If we're going to have these tough conversations about capitalization or any of this other messy stuff that we put up there, we need to trust each other. We need to know each other. We need to try to build those bonds. And this means that you're going to carefully select new board members and hopefully actually have term limits, not just terms. Because I know some boards, people are on there for 30, 35 years. Like, I don't know, like, don't you have a life? You know, and some of those people are so engaged, you don't necessarily, you got to really think that through, right? And how do we keep them engaged, but also say we need some new blood on our board? Orient new boards, and this says to the school, but to the organization. Help them understand the culture and norms of your organization. Provide them glossaries and directories. These are all the members of the board. Help them make connections. You know, one thing some boards like to do at the outset, mission moment, and then will 3 board members say what they're reading right now? And, you know, just kind of randomly, 2 or 3 people say what's on your nightstand if you want them. And, you know, kind of share that. What's the best production you've seen lately? What's your favorite play of all time? What's the best novel that, you know, whatever, great movie that you went to? Just so people are getting to know each other as human beings. And then plan for succession. Have a position description for your board chair. So this also means for committee chairs, for board chairs, but also turning over board members' terms and term limits. Being transparent about that is important. Sorry I'm late, but it seems I misplaced my desire to give it to you. Oh yeah, you want that one, right? Yes. Did you get it? All right. I think you can get the Chronicle review. It's not only what we do, but also what we do not do, for which we are accountable. This gets to one of those things that you said, accountability. Who's responsible? Boards are responsible for what is done and what is not done. The motion has been made and seconded that we stick our heads in the sand. All right. I know, we only have like 1 more minute and then we need to take a break. So, accountability, last best practice of the best boards. And I'm only going to talk about a couple of these. Hopefully you can kind of get them down, but I love the second one. Make decisions as if you, board, had to explain them to stakeholders. Because your executive director does. That's what they do every day. They have to explain what the board talked about, what the board decided. So they've done studies on this and it works really well, and some boards I know are using it. They randomly select, they say at the beginning of a deliberation or discussion, we're going to randomly select 2 of you at the end of this conversation to explain it to an unknown entity outside the board. Random selection. What might you do differently if you're on that board? Pay attention, as opposed to usual. I know you pay attention. What else is going to happen? What else might happen?
Leave.
You leave? Yeah, I worked with a board and they said, every time we have breakout groups, he breaks out. What else?
You incorporate at least your perception of that imaginary other's perspective in your delivery.
Absolutely. You take into consideration that imaginary perception because you don't know who's out there. So one of the things this does very effectively is consider multiple stakeholders. You don't know who's out there. So you're at least going to take that into account. People tend to take notes. They ask better questions. They listen, pay attention. We talked about that. They draw out a different kind of conversation than if they might be the one that's going to have to do it. Okay? And hold executive sessions with your board to reflect on how's the board doing. Have an executive session without any staff except your executive director to say, how are we doing? How did we do at this board meeting? Get some feedback from that person. Give them some space to help you learn and grow. And then sometimes without the executive director, to talk about things that you're afraid to say to the executive in front of the executive director that might not come up. Now that has to be communicated to the executive director, not who said what, but the essence of the conversation if you have an executive session without the executive director. So we are going to take a break. Now I do want to say that we're going to have time because I haven't given you a lot of time for Q&A. But as we move forward after the break, we're going to do an exercise. And then we're also going to have you time to reflect on that, time to ask me some questions. So while you're taking your break, you might be thinking about questions that you have for me, and we have half an hour, basically, for a coffee break. Yes, sir.
One question.
One quick.
Yeah, you said you'd make this available through TCG or?
Yeah, so Della, they're asking about making this available. How will this be available to them? Without the cartoon?
We will put it online after the fall forum and let you all know when it's there.
So it'll be online after the conference, and she'll let you know. Thank you.